October 14th, 1943. 25,000 feet above Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano crouched in the narrow tail compartment of his B-17 flying fortress, the cold cutting through his gloves as he gripped the twin .50 caliber Brownings that seemed heavier than his own body. Through a small bubble of plexiglass, he caught sight of a dark speck sliding into position behind them. A Focke-Wulf 190, approaching from 6 o'clock low, the most lethal angle for any bomber. Romano leaned into the iron ring and bead sight, little more than 2 metal posts that offered no help with deflection or speed, and squeezed the triggers. The tracers flashed wide and vanished. A second later, the German fighter's 20mm cannon stitched fire through the tail section, ripping aluminum like paper. That single exchange played out nearly 300 times that day during the second Schweinfurt raid. The 8th Air Force had sent 291 fortresses deep into Germany without escort. By nightfall, 60 would not return, and more than 130 would limp home so damaged they'd never fly again. 600 airmen dead in one day. At that rate, no bomber crew would statistically survive the required 25 missions. Post-mission analysis confirmed what gunners already knew. The tail position, the fortress's supposed last line of defense, was failing. Under combat conditions, hit rates averaged less than 8%. German fighters attacked from behind, endured a few seconds of inaccurate return fire, then methodically tore the bombers apart. At High Wycombe headquarters in England, senior officers debated the disaster. The Flying Fortress, conceived as a self-defending battleship of the sky, was being dismantled in daylight. Engineers proposed heavier guns, powered turrets, and new sighting systems, but such solutions required months of factory work. Men were dying now. On the hard stand at Bassingbourn airfield, a 22-year-old tail gunner sat on an ammunition crate with a pencil and a maintenance log, sketching ideas that broke every rule in the Army Air Force's technical manual. Michael Romano had no engineering degree, no official authority, just grease-blackened hands and a conviction that something fundamental was wrong. If you enjoy hearing the real stories behind the war, the kind history books forgot, please subscribe to the channel. And tell us what you think in the comments below. Your thoughts and support truly help us keep making more stories like this. To grasp his idea, you have to understand the impossible problem he faced. The B-17's defense philosophy was borrowed from naval warfare. Saturate the air with lead. Dozens of guns, overlapping arcs, every crewman both bomber and battleship gunner. On paper, invincible. In practice, suicidal. Romano had joined the 91st Bomb Group in August 1943 as a replacement gunner. A Pittsburgh factory worker before the war, he'd spent his teenage years repairing blast furnaces, learning metal by touch rather than textbooks. When his father fell ill, he left school to keep the household afloat. The Army later chose him for aerial gunnery, simply because he was small enough to fit into the tail compartment. 6 weeks of training taught him to clear jams, judge distance, and trust luck. His combat station was barely the size of a coffin, a bicycle seat mounted between twin barrels, knees braced against cold alloy ribs of the fuselage. At 40 degrees below zero, wrapped in oxygen lines and bulky gloves, he was expected to perform ballistic calculations in his head while fighters closed at 500 miles an hour. His aiming tool was as crude as it sounded, a circular frame and a metal post. No gyroscopic stabilization, no optical projection. Hitting a target demanded instinct, timing, and a miracle. Even top graduates from peacetime gunnery schools scored only 12% accuracy under ideal conditions. In battle, stress and thin air cut that in half. The Luftwaffe adapted fast. Their pilots attacked from the blind spot directly astern, accepting a brief burst of inaccurate fire before unleashing their 20mm shells. Between August and October, missions to Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Münster became bloodbaths. General Henry Hap Arnold received casualty reports so grim that he questioned whether daylight precision bombing could continue. Boeing engineers were already designing a powered tail turret at the Cheyenne Modification Center, but the conversion required replacing the entire tail section, impossible for aircraft already deployed overseas. Time was a luxury no one had. Romano flew his first mission on August 19, 1943, against Gilze Ryan Airfield in the Netherlands. He fired nearly 500 rounds at 3 Focke-Wulfs and hit nothing. Film review confirmed that every tracer passed harmlessly behind. On the ground afterward, he stayed by his guns long after the engines shut down, his hands shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion and frustration. The problem wasn't the weapon, it was the way they aimed it. That night, he opened his logbook and began to draw. The realization came slowly. Tail gunners weren't missing because they lacked courage. They were missing because they were effectively blind. They needed to see where their bullets would go before they fired. They needed a reflector sight, but installing one in the claustrophobic tail compartment was officially impossible. Unless someone ignored the rulebook. Romano found his unlikely ally in the base sheet metal shop. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic from Detroit, was known as the man who could make anything out of scrap. Before the war, he'd worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps, building bridges and patching machinery with whatever material he could scrounge. When Romano approached him on the evening of October 7th, sketches in hand, Kellerman studied the drawings for less than 5 minutes before setting them down. "This is illegal," he said flatly. "Yes, Sergeant," Romano replied. "You're asking me to alter a defensive weapons system without approval from Engineering Command." "Yes, Sergeant." Kellerman looked at the young gunner for a long moment. "When's your next mission?" "Tomorrow, Münster." "Then we'd better start tonight." They began after midnight, working in a dim corner of the maintenance hangar, lit only by a single inspection lamp. The materials came from wrecked aircraft and forgotten storage bins, curved mirrors from shattered navigation equipment, plexiglass panels from broken canopies, aluminum brackets scavenged from retired airframes. The key component, a small N3A reflector sight from a wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt, was pulled off a scrap heap behind the hangar. Kellerman re-engineered the mounting brackets to fit the tail compartment's cramped geometry. Romano, still in his flight gear, held parts steady while the older man drilled, filed, and improvised. Their goal was audaciously simple: combine a reflector sight with a set of angled mirrors that would allow the gunner to see both his target and the path of his tracers in real time. By 3:30 in the morning, they had a prototype, a Frankenstein assembly of bolts, wire, and plexiglass. The reflector plate projected a bright reticle into the gunner's field of view. 3 small convex mirrors mounted on adjustable brackets offered peripheral glimpses of the gun barrels and their alignment. It looked crude, but promised something no B-17 tail had ever provided: feedback. At 4:30, Kellerman climbed into the tail of Romano's aircraft, knockout dropper, and installed the device. The workmanship would have horrified any Boeing engineer. Safety wire for hinges, bolts from different threads, mirrors attached with adhesive meant for canopy repair. Yet when they finished, Romano knelt in his position and peered through the new sight. For the first time, the world behind his bomber appeared stable, centered, predictable. At dawn, the flight line stirred to life. Mechanics checked hydraulics, refueled tanks, loaded belts of ammunition. Nobody noticed the extra glass glinting in Romano's tail. The crew chief signed off the logbook as standard service. Romano said nothing. He climbed aboard, buckled in, and waited. The mission that day targeted Münster. 236 fortresses crossed the North Sea. Over the German coast, the formation met more than 200 interceptors. Near 11:15 a.m., a Messerschmitt Bf-109, approached knockout dropper from directly astern. Romano swiveled his guns and looked through the new sight. The glowing reticle floated steady despite the turbulence. In the peripheral mirrors, he saw his own tracer pattern the instant he fired. The first burst passed behind. He corrected half a degree, fired again, and watched the tracers converge on the fighter. The Messerschmitt's engine erupted into flame, and the plane rolled inverted, falling away in smoke. He exhaled. It worked. They landed at 1340 hours. While the crew celebrated a rare tail gun kill, the joy lasted less than half an hour. During routine inspection, the crew chief, Master Sergeant Donald Pierce, discovered the unauthorized hardware gleaming behind the guns. Within minutes, the squadron armament officer, Captain Richard Voss, appeared with a clipboard and a thunderous expression. "Sergeant Romano," he said, his tone clipped. "Would you care to explain the non-standard equipment installed in your position?" Romano snapped to attention. "Sir, I built an improved sighting system." "You built what?" Voss's voice rose. "You do realize you violated Technical Order 0120EG2 and half the safety codes in the manual? Unauthorized modifications can compromise structure, interfere with electrical systems, and endanger the aircraft." "Sir," Romano began, "the system works. I don't care if you shot down the entire Luftwaffe," Voss barked, jabbing a finger toward the tail. "That device is not Army Air Force's standard, not Boeing approved, not tested. Remove it immediately, or face court-martial for destruction of government property." Before Romano could answer, his pilot, Lieutenant James Holbrook, stepped forward. "Captain, with respect, my tail gunner scored his first kill today using that sight. Maybe we should—" "Your opinion is noted, Lieutenant," Voss cut him off. "The modification will be removed. That's final." By evening, the entire 91st Bomb Group was talking. Some gunners treated Romano like a hero. Others called him reckless. In the mess hall, debates raged. Could the thing really work? Or had he just been lucky? But not everyone dismissed it. Major William Calhoun, the group operations officer, saw a glimmer of possibility. And at that moment, in a nearby office filled with cigarette smoke and frustration, an emergency meeting began that would decide whether Romano's invention lived or died. The meeting convened that night inside a dimly lit operations office at Bassingbourn. Cigarette smoke hung thick as Captain Theodore Morrison, the assistant armament officer, slammed Romano's nameplate onto the table. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have a discipline problem. A non-commissioned officer has performed unauthorized modifications on defensive armament using salvaged materials of unknown origin. If every enlisted man decides to tinker with government property, we'll have chaos." Half the room nodded. The other half didn't. "Sir," Major William Calhoun interrupted, "that same sergeant just shot down a German fighter using the modification you're condemning. Tail gunners are averaging less than 8% hit rates. If he's improved that even slightly, shouldn't we find out how?" Morrison's expression hardened. "We have no verified data. One lucky engagement doesn't justify violation of Army Air Force's protocol." "Then collect data," Calhoun shot back. "Put him up again with cameras rolling. If it's luck, we'll know. If it's not, we may have just found a way to stop losing 20 bombers a week." The argument spiraled. Engineers warning of safety hazards. Combat officers shouting about body counts. Voices rose until the door opened, and a gray-haired figure stepped in. Colonel Stanley Ray, commanding officer of the 91st Bomb Group, stood silently while the officers snapped to attention. He'd flown bombers in the First World War, a veteran old enough to remember what it meant to lose men by the dozen. "Sit down," Ray said quietly. He listened for nearly an hour as both sides made their cases. Finally, he leaned forward. "Captain Morrison," he asked, "how many aircraft did we lose last week?" 17, sir." "And how many enemy fighters did our tail gunners bring down?" 3, confirmed. Ray nodded slowly. 17 bombers, 680 men, against 3 kills. He turned toward Romano, who had been standing near the door, hat in hand, waiting to be dismissed. "Sergeant, you'll keep your modification. You'll fly the next 3 missions with gun cameras recording every engagement. If your results show measurable improvement, we'll authorize installation across the group. If they don't, you'll face disciplinary action for unauthorized alteration. Understood?" Romano saluted. "Yes, sir." "Good." Dismissed. "And someone get me a copy of those mirror drawings." The decision spread through the base faster than official orders ever did. The next morning, men gathered at the mess line whispering about the kid who beat the rules. To the older mechanics, it sounded like nonsense. To the gunners who had seen too many empty bunks, it sounded like hope. On October 12, 1943, Romano flew again. This time with 2 synchronized gun cameras mounted beside his position to capture proof. The target, Bremen. 236 fortresses climbed through scattered clouds, contrails stretching like chalk lines across the sky. At 11:23 a.m., a Focke-Wulf 190 dived from 7 o'clock high. Romano tracked it through the glowing reticle, saw the tracers in his mirrors, and adjusted in real time. A 3-second burst. Impact. The fighter's left wing root exploded in flame. 20 minutes later, a Messerschmitt 109 swept in low. Romano swung his guns, centered the sight, and fired another controlled burst. The canopy shattered. The German pilot bailed out as his aircraft spun away. By the time Knockout Dropper landed back at Bassingbourn, gun cameras had recorded 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable. Romano had fired 380 rounds, barely 190 per kill. The standard average for tail gunners was 2,800 rounds per confirmed hit. The engineering officers crowded around the footage in stunned silence. Morrison, who had demanded the removal of the modification, watched the film twice before finally muttering, "It works." Colonel Ray folded his arms. "Good," he said. "How long to produce more?" Morrison hesitated. "Sir, we'd need engineering drawings, standardized parts, materials. 6 weeks, maybe more." Ray shook his head. "We don't have 6 weeks. Sergeant Kellerman, how many can you build per day using what's on hand?" The older mechanic scratched his chin. "With help from the sheet metal boys, 4 complete assemblies a day, maybe 5 if we steal parts off damaged fighters." "Then start tonight," Ray ordered. "I want every tail gunner in this group equipped within 2 weeks." "Sir," Morrison protested, "without proper authorization from 8th Air Force." "I'll handle 8th Air Force," Ray cut him off. "You handle the engineering." The meeting broke up in chaos, but Kellerman and his team got to work immediately. They raided the salvage yard for spare reflector sights from downed Thunderbolts, mirrors from wrecked navigation panels, and aluminum scraps from written-off airframes. Inside the hangar, they set up an unofficial assembly line. No paperwork, no blueprints, just instinct and determination. These stories take weeks to research and produce, and we share them so that the sacrifices of men like this aren't forgotten. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe and leave your opinion in the comments. We read everyone, and it truly helps us continue this work. By October 20th, 18 B-17s in the 91st carried Romano's mirror-reflector system. That day's mission to Durin proved the results beyond argument. Out of 47 fighter attacks, tail gunners using the new sights scored 11 confirmed kills, a hit rate of 23%, nearly triple the previous average. The news spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. For the first time in months, the statistics shifted in favor of the bomber crews. On October 20th, the mission to Durin marked a quiet revolution in the air war. Tail gunners equipped with Romano's mirror-reflector system achieved a verified hit rate of over 23%. In just a few sorties, their effectiveness had nearly tripled. Within a week, the system had spread to neighboring squadrons through rumor, imitation, and desperation. Mechanics from the 91st Bomb Group shared Kellerman's improvised blueprints on scraps of paper, each drawing slightly different, but all based on the same principle: feedback through reflection. By October 25th, more than 30 aircraft flew with the illegal modification, each one assembled by hand in the dim light of a hangar corner. The change was immediate and measurable. Enemy pilots accustomed to attacking from the rear found themselves facing far more precise defensive fire. On the November 3rd mission to Wilhelmshaven, gunners equipped with Romano's system scored 16 confirmed kills from 68 enemy attacks. 2 days later, during the Gelsenkirchen raid, they added 13 more. Across 3 operations, the average hit rate held steady at over 20%. For bomber crews who had watched friends vanish in flames week after week, it felt like a miracle. To the Luftwaffe, it was a problem they couldn't explain. German after-action reports began noting increased precision from rear defensive guns. Pilots described seeing tracer streams that tracked accurately instead of flailing across the sky. One veteran, Major Hans Joachim Jobs, a night fighter ace temporarily assigned to daylight operations, recorded in his diary, "The American tail gunners have become far more dangerous. Attacks from 6 o'clock low are now unacceptable unless surprise can be achieved." Word reached High Wycombe headquarters before the end of the month. Staff officers couldn't determine how untrained gunners had suddenly become marksmen. When they traced the reports back to Bassingbourn, Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, decided to see for himself. On November 18th, he arrived unannounced at the 91st. The visit sent officers into panic. Castle was a meticulous engineer and a by-the-book commander, exactly the kind of man who might shut the whole operation down. He inspected the airfield, then the hangars, and finally Knockout Dropper, the B-17 where the first modification had been installed. Romano stood beside his aircraft as Castle ducked into the narrow tail compartment, flashlight in hand. The general studied the arrangement, the welded bracket, the angled mirrors, the scavenged reflector plate, and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he turned to the young sergeant. "How did you know this would work?" Romano shrugged. "I didn't, sir. I just knew the old sights didn't." Castle chuckled softly, the first time anyone had laughed about defensive gunnery in months. "Fair enough," he said. "Could this be built properly? Standardized? Manufactured in quantity?" "Yes, sir," Kellerman replied, stepping forward. "We've got engineering sketches. Most components are salvaged, but we could make proper ones if we had factory stock." Castle nodded. "Then I'm authorizing immediate production across the 4th Wing. Every fortress will carry this modification within 30 days. The order came down the next morning. What had begun as an act of insubordination was now an official directive of the United States Army Air Forces. For Kellerman's team, it meant working around the clock. They turned the Bassingbourn hangar into a miniature factory, fabricating brackets, polishing mirrors, wiring reflector plates. Spare parts came from wrecked fighters, supply depots, even captured German optics. Each day, 4 to 6 complete kits left their improvised line. By early December 1943, over 200 B-17s in the 4th Bomb Wing carried Romano's sighting system. Reports from other groups confirmed the same pattern: improved accuracy, fewer losses, and higher morale. For the first time since the summer, bomber crews began to believe they might actually survive 25 missions. Romano kept flying. Between October and February, he logged sortie after sortie, manning the tail through freezing temperatures and withstanding flak damage that tore through the fuselage like shrapnel storms. His personal tally climbed to 7 confirmed kills and 4 probables, an extraordinary record for a tail gunner. But to him, the real victory was watching the kill ratios change for everyone else. The 8th Air Force Statistical Division began compiling numbers that told the story no press release could. Losses from rear quarter attacks dropped by over 30% between October 43 and March 44. For the first time, bombers could cross into Germany with a fighting chance of returning home. Romano's invention, illegal, improvised, born from frustration, had quietly rewritten the mathematics of survival. By December of 1943, what had begun as a forbidden experiment in a cold hangar at Bassingbourn had evolved into an official engineering program. The 8th Air Force issued field orders designating Romano's design as the Field Expedient Tail Gun Aiming System, Type 1. It was still crude by factory standards, assembled from scavenged reflector plates, handmade mirror brackets, and bolts that didn't always match. But it worked. And in wartime, function mattered more than perfection. At Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center in Wyoming, engineers studying combat feedback began incorporating the same principles into a new powered tail turret under development. When the production B-17Gs began rolling out in January of 1944, their redesigned tail assemblies included a standardized N8 reflector sight, positioned almost exactly where Romano's salvaged Thunderbolt sight had been mounted. The improvement was measurable. Bomber groups equipped with either Romano's field system or the factory. Cheyenne turret experienced roughly 1/3 fewer losses from rear attacks. Airmen who had once described the tail position as a coffin with guns now called it the survivor's seat. Romano himself continued to fly every mission assigned to his crew. Between October and February, he logged more than 20 sorties, most of them deep into Germany. His aircraft returned from nearly everyone bearing new scars, holes from flak, severed control cables, burnt paint, but alive. By February 22, 1944, he had achieved 7 confirmed kills and 4 probables. He was no longer the factory worker from Pittsburgh who couldn't hit a target. He was one of the most effective tail gunners in the 8th Air Force. That same day, Big Week, the maximum effort to cripple German aircraft production, Romano's B-17 took heavy fire over Leipzig. Flak bursts shattered the left stabilizer. Fuel sprayed through the fuselage. Hydraulic lines ruptured, coating the tail section in slippery fluid. Even as the bomber dropped altitude, enemy fighters continued their attack. Romano stayed at his guns, still using the sight he and Kellerman had built months before. He fired controlled bursts until the ammunition belts ran dry, covering the crippled formation as long as the guns could fire. When Knockout Dropper finally went down over Belgium, the pilot managed to crash land in a muddy field. The crew survived the impact, but German patrols captured them within hours. Romano spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in a Luftwaffe run camp. He weighed just 127 pounds when he returned home in May of 1945. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. The citation mentioned notable contributions to defensive armament effectiveness, but avoided any reference to the fact that his invention had originally been unauthorized. Back in the States, reports from the Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed the scope of what his simple modification had achieved. Between October 1943 and March 1944, 8th Air Force bomber groups equipped with the improved tail sight suffered roughly 35% fewer losses from rear attacks. Statistically, that represented hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crewmen who made it home instead of being lost over Germany. At Boeing, engineers quietly acknowledged the source. Internal documents from the Cheyenne plant credited field reports from 91st Bomb Group, Bassingbourn, for key elements of the N8 sight integration. Romano never saw those memos. He wasn't invited to the presentations or engineering conferences. When Boeing representatives later sent a letter requesting his participation in a post-war symposium on bomber armament, he politely declined, writing that he had simply built what was needed to survive. He returned to Pittsburgh, married his high school sweetheart, and took a job as a machinist. For 37 years, he worked in the same plant, building parts for the same kind of machines that had once flown over Europe. He never sought recognition, never gave interviews, and almost never spoke about the war. His children grew up knowing only that their father flew in bombers and fixed some gun sights. But the legacy of his improvised mirror-reflector system lived on far beyond his modesty. The B-17G Cheyenne turret that incorporated his principles became standard equipment on nearly every fortress built after mid-1943. Boeing produced more than 8,600 of them before the war ended. Almost all carried the improved sighting system directly descended from Romano's invention. For the Luftwaffe, the impact was immediate and costly. German fighter units that had once preferred rear-quarter attacks were forced to change tactics. They began striking from head-on, a maneuver that demanded greater skill and carried higher risk. The shift contributed to rising German losses throughout 1944 and accelerated the collapse of daylight air superiority over the Reich. When the war ended, the 8th Air Force's statistical branch compiled the final data that told what official histories often overlooked. B-17 groups equipped with improved tailgun sighting systems, both Romano's field variant and the standardized Cheyenne turret, experienced losses from rear-quarter attacks that were 32 to 37% lower than earlier models. In raw terms, that meant approximately 840 aircraft and more than 8,000 crewmen who survived missions they statistically should have died on. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey called the results operationally decisive. Though it never mentioned Romano by name, the report credited improvised optical innovations in field units for contributing to the increased effectiveness of defensive gunnery. Those innovations were born not in laboratories or command offices, but in a freezing hangar by a 22-year-old sergeant who had refused to accept failure as normal. His simple concept, combining peripheral vision aids with a reflector sight to give real-time feedback, continued to shape design long after the war. Post-war aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress, the B-50, and later the B-52 Stratofortress integrated increasingly sophisticated computing sights, gyroscopic stabilizers, and radar-assisted targeting. But the underlying principle remained identical. Give the gunner instant visual feedback on where the weapons were actually pointed relative to the target. By the Korean War, tail gunnery accuracy had improved fivefold compared to early World War II averages. Every design traceable back to a single improvisation, scribbled in the margins of a logbook at Bassingbourn. In 1983, the 91st Bomb Group Association organized a reunion at the now-preserved Bassingbourn airfield. The hangars had been converted into museum exhibits, the runways quiet except for the occasional commemorative flyover. Romano, then 60 years old, gray-haired and slightly stooped, attended reluctantly after being convinced by his grown children. He hadn't seen many of his wartime comrades in nearly 4 decades. During the event, one man approached him, Gerald Hammond, another tail gunner who had flown with the 91st in late '43. Hammond carried something wrapped in a cloth, a small aluminum bracket, dull with age, with the faint curvature of a mirror mount. "I kept this," Hammond said, his voice trembling slightly. "One of the originals from the mirror site. Because of you and those mirrors, I made it home. My kids exist because you couldn't accept lousy gun sights. Thank you." Romano looked down at the metal fragment, turning it over in his hands. "You'd have done the same thing," he said quietly. "We all just wanted to make it home." But Hammond shook his head. "No," he said. "We all had the same problem. You were the only one who fixed it." The exchange lasted less than a minute, but for those who witnessed it, it encapsulated an entire generation's experience. Ordinary men forced to solve extraordinary problems, guided by instinct rather than instruction. After the reunion, Romano returned to his quiet life in Pittsburgh. He continued working until retirement, then spent his remaining years with family. He never published a memoir, never gave a single televised interview, and declined multiple invitations to appear at veterans' events. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette decades later would mention only a single line: World War II veteran, 8th Air Force. Nothing about the invention that had saved thousands. Nothing about the rule he had broken to do it. Yet among historians and surviving airmen, his story persisted in retellings. The mechanic who defied orders, the gunner who outthought the engineers, the man who changed the mathematics of survival with a handful of mirrors and a salvaged sight. His quiet defiance embodied a truth that would echo through every era of warfare and invention. The best ideas rarely begin with permission. Michael Romano passed away in 2003 at the age of 79. His obituary, printed in a small column of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, simply read, World War II veteran, 8th Air Force. It didn't mention the mirror sight, the hundreds of bombers that came home because of it, or the thousands of men who lived to see peace because one stubborn 22-year-old decided the official manuals were wrong. There was no medal ceremony, no headline, no line in a history textbook. But among the shrinking fraternity of surviving B-17 crews, his name was spoken quietly with respect. They knew. In reunions, when tail gunners gathered to trade stories about frozen gun barrels, oxygen masks icing up, and fighters diving through tracer fire, someone would always mention the guy from Pittsburgh who fixed the sights. The others would nod. They all owed him something, even if they never met him. By then, the world had moved on to jet engines and guided missiles, and few remembered the brutal simplicity of the air war over Germany. But inside every modern fire control computer and helmet-mounted display lay a piece of the principle Romano had discovered under fire. See the truth of your weapon's path before it's too late to correct it. Post-war engineers described progress in terms of electronics and precision optics, but the foundation remained human. Clarity under pressure, the ability to adapt faster than the bureaucracy above. You could react. In that sense, Romano's improvised mirror sight was not just an invention, it was a philosophy. Because innovation in war doesn't begin with generals, it begins with frustration. It begins with a man kneeling in the tail of a frozen bomber, watching tracers miss again and again, and deciding he refuses to die by the book. Historians later attempted to quantify his contribution in charts and ratios, improved accuracy percentages, reduced loss rates, mission survival odds. They missed the deeper truth. His act wasn't about mathematics or engineering. It was about conscience. He couldn't stand to watch friends die when the solution was within reach of his own hands. That's the hidden core of heroism that history often overlooks. Not the medals or orders, but the decision to act when everyone else is waiting for permission. Romano's courage wasn't the kind found in combat reports or award citations. It was the quieter kind, the courage to disobey for the right reasons, to risk punishment for a principle that no regulation could define. Somewhere in a museum display case, among faded uniforms and yellowing mission charts, sits a small, scratched mirror bracket with no label. To most visitors, it looks like a piece of scrap metal. But to those who know, it represents something far greater. The power of a single, unapproved idea to change the fate of thousands. When asked once why he had done it, Romano reportedly answered with a shrug, "Because the old sights didn't work." That simple statement says everything. He didn't think of legacy, recognition, or history. He just wanted the men in his squadron to make it home. And because of him, thousands did. Decades after his death, military historians reviewing wartime archives rediscovered the story in maintenance logs and armament reports. The mirror-reflector modification was listed as an unofficial field innovation of exceptional impact. They traced its origin to the 91st Bomb Group, aircraft serial numbers, maintenance entries written in fading ink. Tail gunner, Sergeant M. Romano. That entry, buried in paperwork once destined for disposal, marked the start of a chain that would influence aircraft fire control systems for half a century. Today, the principle behind his design still endures, not just in aviation, but in the mindset of every engineer, soldier, or mechanic faced with a system that fails when lives are at stake. His legacy is a reminder that history's greatest advances are often made by those who refuse to accept good enough. Michael Romano's story is not one of rebellion for its own sake, but of integrity. The conviction that duty sometimes means defying the very rules written to guide it. And in that conviction, somewhere between courage and defiance, lies the truest form of service. Because the greatest heroes of war are not always the ones who pull the trigger. Sometimes they're the ones who make sure the gun finally aims true. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep bringing you more untold history. Because remembering these men depends on people like you.